Hello everyone and welcome to part 3 of the Splatoon 2 5.3 tier list, and we're finally going to be getting started with the main weapons. If you haven't seen the sub or special weapons, you can check out both those videos in the description. And today we're going to be starting from the absolute worst weapons in the game and ending with the mid-tier weapons. Something to note about the balance of this game is it's actually very good right now, which means even a lot of these mid-tier weapons will still see use and have niches where they can work at if you're good enough with them. So even though these weapons are very low rated, there's still definitely something that can be done with a few of them. So don't count them out if you play any of these weapons. And once again, just as a reminder, this is for competitive play, not solo queue. Anything can and will work in solo. This is talking about 4v4 at the highest level of play in splat zones only. Alright, so starting off with some of the actual bad weapons that this game does have. At the very bottom we have 5 weapons, which is the Sploosh, Luna Neo, Vanilla Clash Blaster, Undercover Brella, and the Goo Tuber. These are all very weak main weapons, the Clash Blaster and the Goo Tuber being the most solid ones out of the two. However, all of them have major flaws in their kit. The Luna Blaster lacks a bomb, and a bomb launcher doesn't really help it push in or be very aggressive. The other Luna kits help it much more. The Sploosh-o-matic Splashdown, which is also a very weak special, as we've covered before, with Curling Bomb being a rather weak sub as well that can situationally help it get in. Clash Blaster, while having Splat Bomb as a nice and solid sub, has Stingray as a special, which since it's a long distance special on a short range weapon, has absolutely no synergy with the weapon. If you want to be able to use Stingray, you basically have to go all the way out of position, use your Stingray, and then go all the way back in, which is a huge problem for it. Blasters also struggle a lot in zones since they typically play for kills, and in an environment where you have to paint more, it can be a lot harder for them to thrive in. So blasters generally have a lot harder time in zones in the first place. Undercover Brella is just an overall super weak main weapon as a whole. A very vulnerable shield and low damage means it's very easy to stall out the weapon, survive and get help, or double team it, and it struggles even fighting some of the most basic 1v1s. Once again, paired with Splashdown and no bombs help push in, is definitely a problem for it. And last up is Goo Tuber. Goo Tuber theoretically does have the potential factor of being a charger and is actually paired with a solid bomb. But once again, Splashdown is a huge factor for this weapon, and Goo Tuber right now as a main weapon is very outclassed by Squiffer, which is very similar, but Squiffer has a lot better strengths, such as being able to charge in the air and having better painting capabilities with MPU, besides the tap shots. It overall just makes it a much better main weapon, and even as we'll see with the higher up custom Goo Tuber, the kit being incredibly similar to Fresh Squiffer but slightly worse, really doesn't help. In the F tier, we have weapons that are a little bit better. The Neo Sploosh having beacon and missiles does give it a solid niche, even though the Octobrush is a similar but better main weapon with the exact same strengths. Beacon, while not helpful outside of map control, will certainly be more impactful than Curling Bomb. And being able to get a lot of tandem missiles is much more impactful than Splashdown, which puts it a little bit higher. The main weapon is still very short range and very predictable, and the Sploosh-o-matic 7 has a much better kit for being able to play more aggressively and pressure heavy, even when they don't have map control. The 52 Gal, while being a mediocre made weapon due to the RNG that it can have from a shot, is paired with a kit that doesn't really help it too much. Curling Bomb is again situationally useful for approaches, but doesn't have a lot of poking power. And Stingray has the same problem with Clash Blaster, where you have to go out of your optimal position in order to use the special. Vanilla Glugas is a weapon that's very interesting. Having a 170 Inkjet isn't the worst special it can have, as it does give it some options for slaying power. However, Gluga struggles in zones because it has a hard inability to paint, and its other two kits give it much more options for how to play around its lack of paint. Ink Mines does absolutely nothing for it, and that means this weapon without map control really struggles. On top of having a special that basically you have to get kills to do much with, just puts it in a really bad situation whenever map control is in the other team's favor, and makes it really hard to counterplay against certain weapons. On top of that, Glugas are just very slow with the rolling end lag, which means a lot of the better weapons can punish them very easily. Blaster and Custom Range are both blasters, which definitely has the struggle factor of this mode having to play for kills, but are more solid main weapons overall, so they're pretty solid in that regard. However, their kits are absolutely abysmal, Toxic Mist being a very mediocre sub-weapon, especially without map control, which is where blasters already struggle, and Splashdown being absolutely garbage. The custom range with Curling Bomb has a bit of a better sub, but the Bubble Blower is really difficult for it to use as the main weapon is slow and doesn't deal a lot of damage from maintaining its bubbles. It can technically do a bubble combo with Curling, but it'll basically drain its entire ink tank, and Range Blaster doesn't really have a lot of gear to run special power-up, which is a problem for it. Lastly is Hydra. Hydra's main issue is that it's kind of slow, but other than that it's fairly solid. It does struggle dealing with chargers, but it can overall still be pretty situational. However, as you've probably figured by now, this thing is paired with Splashdown, which means it's just absolutely worthless to use compared to the other custom Hydra, which just has a much better kit. Moving on to the mid tiers, we see weapons with actual kits that sort of seem to make sense now. Custom Junior is pretty good at painting, it can use double autobomb fairly well with the larger ink tank, and it has 160p ink storms, which means it can use it on the zone fairly well. The main problem with this weapon is it's really hard to get as much pressure, and ink storm isn't really as good a supportive option as something like armor, so the vanilla Junior just often has a better kit. There's definitely some maps where the amount of pressure it has is notable, but overall is still very easy to be ignored and rushed down. Its kit is still definitely okay. Another thing to note is you can't really farm as many ink storms as you can with bubbles or ink armor because you can't farm the special while the ink storm is out, which really hurts Junior since it's very good at getting another special almost immediately. Vanilla Splattershot is a solid main weapon. We'll probably talk more about it later in the higher tiers up here, and Burst Bomb is a solid sub-weapon with it. This is just another case of being paired with Splashdown, making it very weak compared to the other kits, which are vastly superior. A lot of these mid and low tiers just have problems of their other kits being better in almost every way, and Splashshot is definitely one of the cases with Splashdown. Vanilla Squeezer is a very interesting weapon. On some maps it can be kind of useful. The Splash Wall is definitely something interesting for it. Though it does have ink efficiency problems, it can play around a wall kind of alright, which means it's kind of okay with it. Same for Stingray. It's not horrible with it, but it's okay with it. Stingray, you don't have to go too far to be able to use it, but you definitely still have to reposition a little bit. Squeezer is a very good main weapon, and the Foil Squeezer is definitely a lot higher on this list for having a very good kit. But the Vanilla Squeezer having to play around a very situational sub and special just makes it much more mediocre. Kits are very important, and having a kind of below average kit at best is just not a good look. Chariot Tree is another pretty solid main weapon. This one's much better at playing around walls since it has much better ink efficiency. However, Bubble Blower is absolutely horrible for it. H-Tree is another slow weapon that does very low damage to it, but in some situations even worse than Range Blaster. It requires 3 bursts to even pop 1 bubble, which means H-Tree is really bad at maintaining and controlling bubbles. If it had another special, this weapon would actually be a lot higher in most situations, but Bubble Blower just absolutely kills it for it with how little H-Tree does to those bubbles. Next up is the 3 Dapple Dualies. All of these have pretty average kits. Beacon doesn't really do too much for the vanilla kit, but Bomb Rush is alright. Toxic Mist doesn't do as much, but Inkstorm is alright. Both of these subs not doing as much without map control and being more mediocre, with Beacon being slightly better, but the 170 Rain being slightly better than the Bomb Rush. Clear Dapple Dualies has a lot of combo potential with Torpedo, as it forces you to shoot down or focus it, and it can roll Torpedo to kill in 1 less shot. However, once again, being paired with Splashdown is a huge downside for it. The main problem with Dapples is because it has very little range it has to approach, and dodge rolling into enemy map control will get you weak very easily, which means a lot of MPU weapons can kill you. On top of that, the meta is very revolved around staying alive and spacing, so a lot of weapons have solid mobility at the higher tiers, such as Dually Squelchers, or are mid-range to begin with, meaning Dapples just has a lot of ground to cover and not really the tools to do so. Zorella Undercover still has the problem of being an undercover, but has a much better kit than the vanilla one. It's still an aggressive kit, which doesn't really fit it too well because its kill time is just very slow, but being able to have a Splat Bomb to poke is very notable, and a Light Baller is still definitely very useful for pushing in a zone. There's just better baller options for this kind of niche, even if you're trying to go for baller spam to try to force your way into an objective, but it's still at least better than the vanilla kit, and the Splat Bomb can be very useful for it. Kensa Luna is a very weird weapon. Having Fizzy Bomb and Inkstorm means it's actually played rather passively. A lot of Lunas like to run Sub Saver or Sub Power Up to be able to throw double Fizzies, farm Inkstorm, and use the Inkstorm to get an immediate 2 other Fizzies. This means Luna can actually play sort of passively rather than aggressively, which is different than many other blasters. However, it is extremely dependent on Fizzy Bomb spam and Ink Storm spam to do anything. The Fizzies can help approach, but there's other Luna is much better with the kit-wise for being aggressive. The main weapon doesn't fit this passive paint style as well at all. In fact, I'd say this kit on a weapon that could paint would actually be very strong. But what the kit does and what the main weapon does are just two completely different things, which is a huge problem for it. Next up is Custom Blaster and Range Blaster. These are again blasters which have the problem of trying to push back in, which is very difficult, and having to deal with a lot of killing weapons. Another thing blasters have to deal with I haven't mentioned is they have a really hard time dealing with ink armor and HP specials like Baller and Booyah Bomb, because they have a very slow fire rate and low damage per second. This especially hurts these two blasters, as dealing with opponents who are ink armored is very hard, meaning if the opponents want to counterplay to a double ink armor comp or ink armor baller or anything like that, it's just very easy to run things that can deal with blasters very well. There's still a few maps where they can do solid on, but it's overall still very hard. Inkjet and Auto Bomb is a very kill-heavy kit, but I think it fits Custom Blaster fine. Suction Bomb and Inkstorm is solid on Range Blaster, with Inkstorm helping to make up for its paint difference. However, being 200 points for special means it'll barely get Inkstorms at all, which is a huge downside. Next up is V-Machine. Machine is a very strong main weapon, and Auto Bomb is an okay sub for it, but Stingray again is the big factor that holds it back. Its other kits just make much more sense for it, and having to reposition just to use your special is a really big downside when the special's already just average and not great on this mode. Next up, we have 3 rollers with a bit of a similar problem. For Carbon Roller, it's mostly not having the Burst Bomb. Carbon Roller Deco is a lot higher, and we'll explain that more when we get to it, but having a Burst Bomb extremely helps with combo potential, dealing with armor, moving around faster, and just overall having a more effective kill range by using Burst Bomb canceling, where you throw your sub and immediately flick. Vanilla Carbon having Auto Bomb seems okay, but Carbon really needs to play for kills because it's almost all it can do, especially without map control. So having a sub that's kind of mediocre for that, instead of one that's perfect for it, is a huge downside. 160 Inkstorm is fine, but it doesn't really help the main weapon that much. So it's overall just placed here. Crack-On Roller is interesting. The regular roller is kind of the worst of all 4 of them right now. Carbon Roller is just better at killing, and the other 2 rollers are much better at being a support hybrid, which means the only real redeeming quality of the regular rollers is their kits, which all of them have flaws. In this case, while Baller is nice for being aggressive, beacons are very situational. Without map control, you don't paint, you have no tools to get back in, it's just very bad for the weapon. So once you can lock out a Crack-On Roller, it's so hard for it to get back in. On top of that, rollers like blasters have a hard time dealing with armor and Baller/Booyah Bomb due to their lower damage output. While rollers are a bit better at dealing with objects, armor is a huge weakness for them, so it's very problematic in the end. Flingza Roller is a pretty interesting roller. The vertical flick paints so much and can be used safely that it's basically kind of a supportive weapon, which is really interesting for a roller. However, where this weapon falls flat is its kit. While Bomb Rush is a solid supportive supportive special, Splash Wall is just a completely useless sub for the weapon. There's so little situations where you actually want to have a wall on this thing that it just completely ends up being useless for it. The Foil Flingsa kit is much better, as we'll get into having a bomb, which allows it to play much better for this in this current kit. So the other kit completely outclasses it. Next up is the Custom Gootuber. I touched about it a bit briefly, but while Gootuber is a solid weapon, the kit is kind of mediocre here. Overall, Fresh Squiffer is a huge outclass on this thing, as while it's a similar main weapon, it's overall stronger with its ability to charge in the air and the MPU for range, and having a faster charge time. On top of that, it has Suction Bomb while comparing to the Gootuber's Curling Bomb, which is just a flat-out better sub. The special of Inkjet is still mediocre for zones in the first place, but at least it's a bit better with Fresh Squiffer than it is here. Overall, Gootuber has a really big problem with its kits, when it already has to deal with a lot of competition and shorter range chargers from Squiffer and Bamboo, which I haven't even touched on yet. Next up is the Kemsa Chargers. I'm going to be real with you, K-Charger mains. I know there are a lot of you who love the weapon, and Baller is definitely a fun special for being more aggressive and keeping yourself alive, but this thing just cannot compete with Charger and Firefin and Vanilla E-Leader. Overall, the Sprinkler is just very useless for it, as it's not even going to farming a team special like Bomb Rush or Ray. And while Baller is not the worst thing it could have, it's still a completely selfless special that doesn't really help for much besides aggro positioning, which Firefin can already do with its wall anyway. Lastly is Custom E-Leader. You'll notice that the unscopes are ranked higher than the E-Leaders, and that's because you already have a lot of range when playing E-Leader, so the advantage of having more range with scope isn't nearly as good as the mobility bonus from being able to hold your charge. Overall though, while Beacon is a okay special for the E-Leaders as it's a long-range weapon, Bubble Blower is again something it has very little actual impact on. Even if it can get a good amount of it, it can't control it, and most of the time you don't even want to be focused on sniping your own bubbles, which leaves it in just a very awkward spot. Next up on the tier list, we have the D tiers, and these are weapons that are very close to being better, but are just held back by some small weaknesses. Silver Aerospray is basically your niche for every good Curling Bomb Rush map. If you like Curling Bomb Launcher, and you don't like Tent, you can use this for some of these maps. 160p Curling Launcher is incredibly useful for some zones maps, so I think this weapon actually has a really good niche on maps like Humpback or Skipper Pavilion. The weapon paints exceptionally well, and Suction Bomb is a solid bomb. The main weaknesses that this thing has is just its kill time is absolutely abysmal. Even other shorter range weapons like Junior have a much better and more reliable kill time compared to this, so it ultimately leaves Aerospray with a bigger problem. As for Gold Aerospray, remember how I mentioned a light baller niche being able to pressure and get up close with Sorella undercover? Yeah, this is a thing that does it better. Much better paint, a bit better mobility, and still able to get a light baller fairly fast. Sprinkler is still kind of mediocre, and the weapon still can't fight for shit. But in terms of having a niche of being able to baller around and pressure zone, this is the weapon that has it a bit better. Still not an amazing weapon, but at least it has a niche and something it could do well. Vanilla Splash has definitely been hotly debated, but in my opinion I just don't think it's very good. The main problem is it just cannot approach without farming Inkjet. The weapon is very short-ranged and Mist does nothing to help with that. On top of the weapon being outranged by things like 52 and shot, let alone mid-range weapons, it just puts it in a really struggling position. Neo Splash is a much better example of a kit that makes up for this, with burst bombs being a nice mid-range threat and being able to get a bunch of bomb rushes. The thing Splash does have going for it is it paints exceptionally well. However, again, that's just much better with the other kit, as spamming Inkjet isn't really the best trait to have in zones in the first place. 52 Gal is a solid main weapon like we've talked about before, and having Baller is a solid aggro special that it can get fairly fast. The main problem here is point sensor. Not having a bomb is really a huge downside for short-range shooters, but point sensor is just even worse than not just having a bomb. It's quite literally the worst sub it could have, and it barely helps it at all. Next up is 96. 96 Deco is a very interesting weapon. It's basically running MPU on 96 allows you to do around 70 damage per shot, which basically has it as you can't approach me or you're going to die very easily. So it's overall pretty solid at that. However, 96 playing passively behind its wall is all nice until you realize you're farming Splashdown, which just makes it not really that worth it. If it had a supportive special like armor on this kit, I could see it being really strong because 96 is very difficult to rush down, and wall actually has a lot of synergy with it. Splatoon 1 had 96 Deco as a really strong main weapon with a very good special, but unfortunately Splashdown just isn't worth it in this case. KO3 is very similar, L3 being another mid-range painting one, this one being less of don't approach but more of an aggressive one. However, L3 can't really be as aggressive with wall as it would like, and Hammer, while being a solid special, is ultimately not the best thing for this weapon, compared to the Inkjet one of the L3D, which plays a lot better. Ultimately, while it's a solid main and special weapon, the sub-weapon really holds it back because it's very limited to be used. There's still some maps where you can play around wall very well, like Camp Triggerfish, where this weapon could see some use, but overall it's outclassed by its other kits. N-Parries and Tetras have similar flaws. I'll start with N-Parries, Curling Bomb being the mediocre sub, and Inkjet being a mediocre special, though at least fitting well in a Slayer like this. The big problem with dualies is the dodge rolls, once again, can get you taking slight damage at enemy ink, which in a meta where there's a ton of MPU weapons that will kill in one less shot if you take a slight amount of damage is really problematic. Dualies are also pretty ink heavy compared to splatter shots and other short range shooters, meaning you can't really poke or paint as well without running out of ink, which is kind of an unusual downside for the weapon. Tetra dualies are a pretty solid dualie main weapon, honestly. The 4 dodge rolls mix-up and the range it has, as well as being able to shoot with dodge rolls, is actually really solid. However, the weapon can't paint for shit, and is set with 2 of the worst kits in the game. Having both of the worst specials with auto rush and splashdown is just absolutely horrible for it. The problem with Tetra is that it basically has to either take someone's attention or kill, or it does absolutely nothing. So just the amount of value it gets by default is really hard, and when other weapons can afford to just play slower and not go for kills, it just puts you in a really bad situation. Next up is the Luna Blaster. Luna Blaster here is a much better kit, at least, than the others. Having a splat bomb for poking in neutral and a baller that's lightweight is a very helpful kit for it. It's mostly held back by the main weapon at this point, which is very low range and again struggles to get kills against high mobility, especially when other weapons don't really need to fight it. Clash Blaster Neo is a bit similar, but instead being a more mid-range option as the explosions are quite large. This can be used for tick damage or to play over walls, but is still very limited. Missiles are a solid special for it, and curling is an okay sub for pressure. Not an amazing kit or main weapon, but it still works fairly well. Clash Blaster is actually good against armor, though it still struggles against HP specials because of its high fire rate. However, Rapid can take advantage of a higher fire rate much better, since it can actually stay at an effective range, while Clash can get rushed very easily. Next up is Grim. Burst Bombs aren't an insane combo tool like they used to be in the first game, but can still be solid for confirming kills or damage. It's a nice poking tool, and the lower points for special missiles make it much better than the vanilla range blaster. However, range is the weakest blaster at dealing with armor and object HP specials, which means it can be counterpicked a lot and can really struggle on top of having to play for kills. You basically have to take advantage of the directs you can get at that range because it's the only upside that's going to carry it at this point. But it's just really hard to do that consistently, even at higher levels of play. Next up, we have the 2 regular rollers. These both have some flaws. Curling Bomb is actually the positive in this case. As for regular roller, it gives it a mobility option it needs to get in. However, Splashdown is just going to get you killed. The other roller, on the other hand, has a nice bubble combo that it can achieve, but doesn't really have any tools to get it in. As well, Splat Bomb is a nice poking tool. Short-range rollers really need a sub that can help it approach, and it just doesn't have anything for approaching or killing. Splat Bomb and the Bubble Blower combo are still very strong. However, other Bubble Blower weapons like Forge and Foil Squeezer can get this combo much more often, since Kensa Roller doesn't really paint very well. The Vanilla Ink Brush is a very solid weapon that unfortunately is just paired with Splashdown. Splat Bomb is nice, but the other 2 Ink Brush kits are actually insanely good, meaning there's just really no reason to use this over the Baller or Armor one. Not much to say about it, just outclassed. Kensa Mini is another interesting one. The main weapon is very solid, but the sub just doesn't have a lot of synergy, and Toxic Mist is also very weak right now. Hammer is a solid special for it, and it could get it quite a lot. I could honestly see Kimmy being higher, but I think its other kits are both better, especially the vanilla one having a really good sub for it. So in terms of the hammer niche, I just think the Sploosh 7 and Kensa Octobrush are better in that regard. But we'll get to that later. I still think Kensa Mini is a solid weapon that could prove to be higher. Next up is Heavy Deco. Heavy Deco is a pretty interesting weapon. Heavy tends to be pretty outclassed by ballpoint and chargers, so Heavy's main dependency is on its kits and painting capability. While Wall is okay, allows you to be aggressive some places, Bubble Blower is overall pretty average as well. Right now, there just isn't that many situations that deem the use of Heavy Deco outside of maybe a map or 2. So it doesn't really seem to fit in right now compared to its other kits. Overall, it's a solid kit and an average main weapon, but that's the kind of thing. It's just average at everything, which means it's very easy to be outclassed by other options. Ballpoint Splatling is a very interesting main weapon. It used to be very strong before its nerfs, but it's still a very solid jack-of-all-trades weapon that can surprise people. Its kill time at long range isn't amazing, but it still has very solid range on it, being able to outrange Heavy, and its close-range kill time can be very surprising, with it still having solid mobility. It's basically the backline that has its best job at being able to defend itself. Toxic Mist is just a really hold back of a sub for it, and Inkjet is very situational. With another kit, Ballpoint can still be very good, but having a kind of weird hybrid frontline midline kit just doesn't really work for it very well, and there's not too many situations to abuse its kit, which ultimately puts it here. Lastly is the custom melee leader. It's the same thing as we talked about earlier, but this time it's the unscoped version, which means it's just a little bit better because of mobility with the charge hold. And that's it for the mid and low tiers. Definitely a lot of weapons that are sadly held back mostly because of kits or one crucial flaw, but that tends to be how it is for weapons like this. It's good that they're not held back by a lot, and there's definitely a good amount of weapons here that if a player wants to get really good at them, could maybe be pushed and proven to be higher, but ultimately a lot of these weapons have kits or main weapon flaws that hold it back, at least in zones. But let me know what you think. Next time we'll be talking about the high tiers, which will be getting into some really interesting weapons. It's basically the potential arguments of Splatoon. If you have a weapon that you think is close to being good but isn't shown there, it's probably in that tier. So it's my favorite to go over. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.